And well, I'm really very happy and honored to introduce and present our today's guests, Mikael, Baaz, and Mona Lilja, or
Lilja.
Lilja, okay. And they will talk about the ABC of resistance today. Mona Lilja currently serves as a professor of peace and development research at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Lilja's areas of interest is the linkages between resistance and social change, as well as the particularities, the character and emergence of various forms of resistance. She's the author of the recently published book, a year ago, Constructive Resistance, Repetitions, Emotions, and Time. Whereas Mikael Baaz is a full professor of international law, as well as an associate professor of political science and an associate professor of peace and conflict studies. He currently works at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, where he serves as head of the department of the Law Department, School of Business, Economics, and Law. I was, today, while I was preparing for this meeting, I went to check the emails, and when this communication really started, people who are longer here and who were very much involved with the building of our long-term project, Social Engagement Studies, will remember that that took place in 2016. Wow. It was really, really long time ago when our former director, Petar Bojanic, came to visit Gothenburg, and when you met, and then we exchanged, and then that exchange, unfortunately, was taking most of the time place during COVID, and the beginning of COVID. But it was then that we really started to discuss about resistance and what it can be done with it. And I remember when we were trying to put that in the frame of practical, how to make resistance and studies of resistance, especially this post-structuralist model, which was important to you back then, to put it in some kind of practical, even administrative frame of the European Commission projects. And when we finally managed to bring you here and to talk about resistance, I was happy to see that there is still this ABC idea. And ABC refers to A, avoidance, B, breaking, and C, constructive resistance. So these three form together something which would be an ABC of resistance. So as we translated it here, abecedarium, something very elementary when it comes to resistance. So I'm already full of questions before you began, but I will keep myself quiet. And please, the floor is yours, and then we will, I hope, have a nice talk afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think that we are here today to represent our Resist research group, which consists of more people than us. It's Stella Minthagen and Mikael Schultz, thank you, who are not here today. Resist was created in 2003, so we have been collaborating for several years. Among others, we have done extensive research in India, Japan, and Cambodia, and also Palestine. And just as an example,
Let me help you.
okay, thank you.
Oh, that will.
These are some of the books that we have just presented during the last years. A co-monography and my own book, and also Mikael's book on resistance in Palestine. But today I'm not here to present one of these books, but I will present our latest work on the ABC of resistance. And that is how we kind of elaborated with the theories on resistance, the already existing theories of resistance, or the field. We would like to argue that the current field of resistance studies is kind of divided into two different strands. One is dealing with organized resistance, like social movements, mobilized resistance that are collective resistance. And the other strand is the scholarship of everyday resistance or hidden resistance that mainly draw on James Scott, for example. And our research group, we found it difficult and maybe complicated that resist studies is mainly people who do research on resistance are mainly in one of these two fields. And we wanted to overbridge that, and so we wrote an article Actually, first a chapter which is published. I cannot send it around though because I don't have the right to it. But but now we are talking about. Oh, now I've written an article that we hope to get published soon, and the article argues for an ABC of resistance, where we want to kind of overbridge this divide between organized resistance studies and everyday resistance studies. Yeah, I think that we'll probably say the same thing in the next slide. Yeah, and I assume that you recognize this, right? Do you? That people who are into organized resistance, collective and contentious politics, they very much deal with the organization, and individuals only make sense in some sense when they are like participants, leader, or organized in any organized event. Then individuals make sense, otherwise not. So we argue that this strand of research, they are very much into also public resistance, organized in public mostly. And then we would say that everyday resistance, on the other hand, there we focus on how it's hidden, the hiddenness of resistance. And that is one of the key features of everyday resistance. And we would say that if the organized resistance scholarship do not deal with individuals, the everyday resistance scholarships do not deal with organized resistance. But I'm thinking that we all know that there are organized resistance, which is hidden, right? So we need to develop the different categories that we work with. And we need to broaden the field of resistance studies. And not only that, we need to also see the connections between different forms of resistance, how individual and organized resistance in different forms depend on each other or provoke each other or overlap. And so we will talk more about that later. Yeah, I kind of said that now. To do this, to move on from the current categorization of the field, we will, as you said, introduce first 3 different forms of resistance that where we broaden the current categories, but also add a category of our own, the constructive resistance category. And we have called it ABC because it's easy to remember, right? Could have called it something else, but. Do you want to say something about the?
Yes, I can do that. It would be a bit awkward otherwise, wouldn't it?
So, I can leave the category.
So I will.
I can keep on talking.
No, that's fine.
I'll leave the categories to you, and then I can talk about the overlaps and.
Yeah, very good.
Provoke.
So as Mona said, we have been kind of struggling over the years trying to understand what resistance studies is and what resistance studies could be. And part of that elaboration is to be found in the book Researching Resistance. We also have a few papers where we're trying to catch the state of the art and so on and so forth. And this work that we are going to present today could be considered as part and parcel of that work, trying to make categories, trying to understand the field, and so on and so forth. It's also perhaps a very modest attempt to create synthesis between different approaches, trying to struggle with perhaps not even divided, but a dividing field, trying to catch the complexity and at the same time trying to establish some kind of order. So I will walk you through the different categories: avoidance resistance, breaking resistance, and constructive resistance before handing over to Mona again. And let's start with avoidance resistance. And our point of departure is that resistance studies have basically gone through similar stages as the studies of power. And although when the study of power began, it was more focused on the explicit forms, different power expressions. Then we could conclude that during the 1970s, it became a bit more subtle, and symbolic and dispersed forms of power were increasingly acknowledged within academia. Similarly, the earlier one-sided focus on more obvious and dramatic forms of resistance have lately been supplemented through a recognition of a more subtle and a more diffuse articulation of resistance. And one, as Mona indicated, important scholar in this regard is, of course, James Scott and his concept of everyday resistance. And I just saw the slide here, and it was quite funny because I'm at the Department of Law, but the paragraph sign, which has sneaked into the presentation, is a pure mistake actually, or there is something magic with my computer. It adds those characters without me knowing. But nevertheless, the key characteristics of everyday resistance is the use of disguise through either concealment of anonymity of the resistor, in which the person, not the class identity of the protesters or the act itself, is kept secret. Thus, either a clear message is delivered by a disguised messenger, or an ambiguous message is delivered by clearly identifiable or identified messages. All this according to Scott. By this, Scott highlights the complicity of resistance by displaying how various forms of domination limit resistance and make it take form of being hiding, and we would like to add avoiding. Everyday resistance is then basically the resistance that is quiet, dispersed, disguised, or otherwise seemingly invisible. It is a form of resistance that exploited people, subalterns, use in order to both survive and undermine repressive domination, especially in the context where rebellion or open resistance is way too risky. By doing this, Scott fundamentally transformed our understanding of politics by making the ordinary life of various subaltern subjects part of political affairs. He also directly played an inspirational role for the international establishment of what we know as subaltern studies, as a distinct approach to history from below, particularly in India and South Asia. And we have to acknowledge and recognize that Scott still inspires numerous empirical studies on everyday resistance, and he is a highly quoted social scientist still, with more than 100,000 quotes on his Google Scholar page. So, I mean, he is influential. And we have applied this way of reasoning into the liberal peace debates, where the concept of everyday resistance has served as a means to reveal new aspects of peace-building processes. And by drawing on Scott as well as the Sartre, the concept of everyday resistance has become central to the critique of liberal peace interventions, or we could say liberal interventions more generally. Among others, however, the elaborations of the concept of resistance remain, we would like to argue, rather limited within this research strands. There are work done, and among others, working within what is labeled as the local term, Marta Ingves de Herrera argues that Scott's point was not to create a different realm of politics, but to show that both formal and informal forms of resistance were part of the same context and operated under the same structures, just through different means. She rightly emphasizes how resistance, irrespective of the form it takes, is constructed within the context of where it is played out. We would like to propose that avoidance resistance must not necessarily be seen as informal, individual, or everyday. It can also appear as an organized collective practice, even on a grand scale. One prominent example, to put some more flesh on the bone, is the primary form of revolt against the chattel slavery in the Americas. The multitude of the maroon communities formed by runaway slaves in South America and the Caribbean from the 16th up until the end of slavery serves as good examples. The Maroons, they created their own communities in secluded territories such as swamps, jungles, mountains, ranging from tiny bands of autonomous towns and even states, some of them surviving only briefly before becoming recaptured, while others sustained themselves for generations. So here we do have a good example of an organized avoiding resistance. Although their avoidance of enslavement began in dispersed and organized forms, based on individual or small groups, it amounted to a mass phenomenon. This opened up space for the building of self-governed and semi-free communities with its own justice systems, food productions, set of rights, and formed a basis for collectively organized resistance against recapture and punishments. And this is quite remarkable if we choose to acknowledge that this was done without a common language in diverse groups that only shared a desperation for survival, situated in a foreign continent, relegated to the worst territories without any resources of powerful protection. Yet, some communities became strong enough to constitute a threat to the surrounding slave society, making treaties possible that recognized in a formal sense their autonomy. One of the biggest Maroon community in Brazil had more than 10,000 inhabitants, and it survived for nearly 100 years before it was crushed eventually by a series of Portuguese military invasions. We could also mention the Maroon community in Haiti, which played an important role in the Haitian Revolution, which took place at the end of the 18th century. And by this we also see the formation of a first Maroon nation state. There are also a number of autonomous Maroon towns still working and operating, performing resistance on an everyday basis in Jamaica and Brazil. And someone has decided to count all those societies, and they measure up to somewhere around 2,000 officially certified communities all around the world, where we, for example, have the Zapatistas as a very interesting example, which makes sense when we are continuing our discussions on breaking and constructive resistance and the entanglements and the interactions of this resistance. The maroon communities as the lowest common denominator shows how avoidance on a mass scale is in fact a very effective form of resistance to the structural violence of slavery, and how this avoidance resistance formed the basis for other forms of resistance, which we will talk about briefly in a short while, namely breaking and constructive resistance. In the example we see a mass mobilization of avoidance resistance, and there have been some merits into classifying them as everyday resistance. But if so, they are not accurately described as individual or non-organized, but is rather understood as dispersed mass waves and networks. So here we have a surface contradiction that is to be hidden and yet still be a movement. And we argue in our paper that there is no contradiction in being hidden and yet still being a movement. The perceived anonymity of the internet use makes it possible to post as someone else or to construct new identities at the same time as the advanced communication network makes the coordination of gigantic numbers of people possible. So here we see a more modern and an online phenomenon facilitated through various new technologies, and we have Wikipedia as a good example of that. So what we would like to suggest is that the mass-based resistance also can be hidden and find ways to avoid power. This, by extension, means that the line that is often drawn between individual and collective forms of resistance should be questioned and new forms of resistance explored. One thing, among many others, it should embrace is that avoidance as resistance, which is hidden and shuns different power expression, can also be individually dispersed as well as collectively organized. Hence, covered and hidden forms of resistance should not always be counted as everyday resistance or even be seen as small scale. So that is how we have elaborated the concept of avoidance or avoiding resistance. Now turning to the second category in our ABC model, breaking resistance. The notion of resistance as avoidance needs to be complemented or supplemented with another conceptualization of dissent, and that is the power-breaking resistance. And we call that simply breaking resistance. Breaking resistance operates according to a quite different logic than avoidance resistance, and more publicly and openly challenges power. This resistance might be articulated as protests, strikes, civil obedience, objections, and so on and so forth. The power breaking here indicates how a power relation is, may it be temporarily, locally, or potentially, is ruptured by someone who performs a subordinated position through some kind of public refusal to do what is ordered or expected by them or of them. Here, rules, laws, or orders that are normally obeyed or accepted are in a quite offensive manner challenged. Resistance of this kind has mostly been discussed within the widespread field of contentious politics or social movement studies, but also within the more new and emerging field of nonviolent action studies, or the studies of civil resistance. Fields that, as a lowest common denominator, have maintained a focus on collective mobilizations. Nonviolent action or civil resistance studies is a field that is especially useful for peace-building efforts, since it is primarily oriented towards a critique of tactics against and alternatives to violence as part of power and resistance. Through its emphasis on resistance as non-violent, or, if you like, civil, the democratization or overthrowing of authoritarian regimes or militarized dictatorships. The contentious politics frameworks claim that most political undertakings are routinely forgotten this, I was speaking for a short while. The contentious politics framework claims that most political undertakings are routinely applied conventional acts, such as reading newspapers, registering, filing documents, and so on and so forth, while some form of politics are contentious, involving movements, but also war, revolutions, or terrorism. While the conceptualization of continuous politics provides a sophisticated analytical tool and a novel theoretical framework, it, as with the theorization of the everyday literature, continues to ignore significant aspects, significant forms of resistance. Contentious politics excludes acts by small groups of individuals from what they count as events, and explicitly limits the scope to forms of contentious that display public, collective interaction with contentious politics, when it is organized within collectives, either as leaders, organizers, or participants in collectively organized events. In contrast to this, we could call common understanding, we suggest that contentious politics can be both individualized and collectivized, which is something that the fields of nonviolence and civil resistance have convincingly shown. If contentious politics is understood as being in opposition in a public and non-public cooperative style, then individual or small-scale resistance should be included. Individual resistance can certainly sometimes be extraordinary and is not necessarily everyday or avoiding in its expression. One example of individual dispersed yet dramatically contentious resistance is the Buddhist monks burning themselves to death in Tibet as a protest against the Chinese regime and, by extension, the Chinese occupation. These self-immolations have made the Chinese government accusing the Dalai Lama of terrorism in disguise after he led prayers for those who set fires on themselves. This kind of individual contentious politics should be, we argue, included into a theoretical framework of resistance and, by extension conflict and peace building. Though Individual small-scale or dispersed forms of contentious resistance action, which impact on conflict patterns or peace-building attempts, do not fit the conventional understandings of everyday resistance as they are contentious, or social movements as they are small-scale or individual. Some of these dispersed forms of resistance might be viewed as violent, as for example the self-immolations just mentioned, property destruction, looting or riots, and do also not easily fit within the framework of civil resistance. We propose in the paper that rigid field delimitations are a mistake that emanates from a too narrow categorization that exclude significant and creative forms of resistance. It seems clear that the core concept of social movements, as well as everyday resistance, continuous politics, and civil resistance, does not capture the particular logic of this kind of public and order challenging resistance. And in our understanding, breaking resistance is viewed as a category that should include both individualized and collectively organized forms of challenges to power. It captures the logic of resistance when individual, small groups and or movements of activists engage in various acts of contentious politics. Finally, I will even more briefly introduce to you our take on the last letter in the model, the C, standing for constructive resistance. Resistance is, we argue, not only protests or disobedience against various institutions, practices, or actors, but sometimes it constructs new institutions, identities, discourses, communities, or practices, such as underground universities, alternative currencies, or, as I have studied, various judicial tribunals or tribunals inspired by the legal framework. Here, resistance is not mainly against something, but rather a matter of building new alternatives or nodes in social change. Constructive resistance, more generally speaking, could be seen as a response to power, a practice that perhaps undermines different modes and aspects of power in their enactments, performance, and constructions of alternatives to the already existing. Resistance, in this sense, needs to be more than just a mere refusal or binary opposition to power that just affirms its negotiation. Resistance requires a creative or imaginative practice that furnishes us other modes of being known, seen, and conducted. Here we find research in this vein or in this strand that build on alternative institutions. For example, research on the Kurdish movement in Turkish Kurdish region, where alternatives, constructive alternatives, are developed as acts of constructive resistance. Other scholars in this vein discuss the productive modes of resistance in terms of, for example, meaning-making or the construction of alternative identities. For example, the decolonial turn argues for new local knowledge-making from subaltern identity positions. So, after having introduced the three categories or fleshed them out a bit, Mona should now take over and walk you through some intersections and then hopefully present a few concluding remarks as well. So, please.
Yeah, now I've outlined three rather simple ways of looking at resistance, right? And so let's bring in all the complexity to it now. Well, first of all, we think that one single practice of resistance can really be seen as several of these dimensions. It could be seen as birth, breaking, constructive, and so on. And I will develop that soon. And we also would like to bring temporality and time to this, because how a resistance develops over time, it can change from being avoidance to becoming breaking, and then going into some kind of a constructive mood. So you can use the model somehow to see how resistance develops over time. And thirdly, we would like to say that one kind of resistance actually enables or provokes another kind of resistance type. So that is the three intersections that I would like to dig into here. Let's start with the first point there that I talked about. Well, first of all, as Scott said, as Mikael said, the everyday or hidden resistance could be both about someone hiding his identity as a form of hiding the resistance, right? So the act could be still obvious, or you hide the act but not the identity. So that is the two ways to go. So saying that, it could be both a breaking act of resistance can therefore obviously be both hidden in the sense that the resistor avoids revealing his identity, but still the act is breaking. So you see what I mean? It could be both avoidance and breaking in the same act. Yeah. I assume that's a good example of that. And I'm thinking another example could be the artist Banksy, who actually hides her identity, but whose resistance is rather breaking, but also could be constructive, because in one sense he or her develops alternative narratives around things, political statements, establishing norms around different themes. So in one sense, his resistance could be seen as both breaking, avoidance, and constructive. But still we would like to argue then that it's important to make visible all these kind of dimensions of Banksy's resistance. And by using this model of the ABC, you actually can reveal things and discuss resistance in a new manner that is more illuminating. The second point that I took up is that resistance strategies change or evolve over time. And Mikael just mentioned the Maroon Society and the Maroon Societies, and how they actually went from avoidance, like hiding, to going into revolution, which could be seen as kind of breaking resistance, right? So you can obviously see that things are changing. And also thinking about our research in Palestine, where it's obvious that at some points the whole community turns more about developing women's organizations, developing institutions, developing new patterns, habits, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it's about more breaking kind of resistance, where non-violent acts are more like protesting, refusing, disobeying. So I think that also in that context, I think that it's highlighting some important patterns. Thirdly, that one resistance strategy enables another resistance strategy. And I think it's kind of odd that these kind of connections are not really revealed in the resistance literature today. How there are so many connections between individual and organized resistance and hidden resistance. and obvious and public resistance. But I think that it's important to really, dig into and try to disentangle these patterns where one kind of resistance, open up space for other kinds of resistance. And again, we can turn to the Maroon Society, because that would be an example of that. How these societies, which were hidden for 100 years, made it possible to do a revolution, right? In a later stage, in another time. But also, like when we interviewed land right activists in Cambodia, it became really obvious how they were hiding activities. They were hiding their community. They were hiding their activities, even where there came spies to look at to try to connect and participate in their activities. They used different strategies to lie, to make up stories, to create alternative narratives. And this hiding became the base for really going out and doing public acts of resistance, organized public acts of resistance. So again, it's about, you can see that avoidance of resistance enable, breaking resistance, which I think is important to display. And I was also thinking about when we talked to James Scott a couple of years ago. He told us a story about his first book. He said that he went 2 years to Malaysia, right, to collect his field data. And then he went back, he wrote his book, and then he said, like, well, wait, I take the last chapter, I let the villagers write that chapters to comment on my brilliant findings, right? So he went back to the village and he said, like, now I'm going to present to you my book. And he went on and he presented the book, and then he said, well, you can have the last chapter to say something about my findings. And the villagers said, like, well, actually you misunderstood the whole thing. You missed the point. You've been here for 2 years and you haven't understood anything. And then so he found himself in the position that he had the option of either keep the book and let the villagers be brilliant in the last chapter, right? Or he could just take the book, just throw it away, and restart the whole project and write that chapter himself under his own name. So that is what he did. But I'm thinking that the whole story just says something about how the villagers, when they sit down, they said that you have misunderstood our political action totally. So what we have done is kind of everyday hidden resistance, but you haven't seen it even though you've been here for 2 years. You missed it. And I'm thinking that in that moment when the villagers sat down and told each other about the individual resistance that they played out, it somehow became collective, right? So it kind of, from being everyday hidden, it turned into be something really collective and somehow organized. So I think that if you can see all this connection between the organizing and collective, you get a whole new dimension, a whole new perspective of resistance, which I think is important, which we think are important. And very interesting, yeah. So, so let's conclude. So we want to promote this ABC of resistance. But also doing that, we realize that it's really simplified with these categories, and we also want to highlight all these interesting things that it makes you see, all the connections that it illuminates as when you dig into these kind of different categories of resistance. And so we would say that this ABC resistance framework that is actually fills a gap within the current field of resistance studies. And we would like to argue that we have to rethink the field as it looks like now. I think that the field like organically developed and turned into something which is not really useful if we want to like see all the complexity of resistance. You want to add something to that?
Yeah, we don't want to repeat the James Scott experiences that now we have been writing the this brilliant paper, and now you will tell us that everything is wrong. But on the other hand, I think that perhaps that is why we are here. So
and we will move back and take your ideas and rewrite the chapter.
yeah. I also want to say that it's exactly 4 o'clock, and you said that we are not allowed to talk for more than 40 minutes, and I think that we managed quite impressively.
You have, but that's not exactly what I said.
Now, that was my interpretation. I misunderstood it entirely. You resist that. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I would like to invite you to, if you don't feel comfortable with English, you can say that in Serbian and I will translate, or in English, please. Srđan and then Gazela, Srđan Prodanović.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation. As someone who was also part of this social engagement group, I remember when we debated your engagement. So the first question pertains to this. This is something that you actually touched upon at the end of your presentation. This is this transfer from individual to collective. So what are the mechanisms? What are the main theoretical insights about that? So how is this jump achieved? Because it seems to me, at least from the engagement perspective, this is where you have some kind of intersection between engagement and resistance. So that's the first question. And the second one, also somewhere in the presentation, it's mentioned that there is resistance can be some kind of reservoir for revolution. But then how would these radical forms of social change fit into the ABC of resistance? Thank you again.
Would you like to collect the questions or would you like to?
I mean, I feel comfortable with anything. I mean, what do you normally do? I mean,
However you prefer.
yeah.
Really.
Do you have any preferences?
No, not really.
Sorry.
I would like to have a document to write down the questions, maybe.
I mean, I think, let us reflect upon the good questions. And I mean, what you touches upon is the question of upscaling in one way or another. And I think that this is one of the key issues when you're interested in studying social change. And while Mona is thinking of a more sharp answer, I should just give you a brief reflection. And Mona's uncle, he is in medicine, and he has been working in the pharmaceutical industry for his entire life. And the work process that they have is that they develop a substance which they think could be have an effect against the disease or something like that. But then when they start to upscale it, it starts to behave in a very, very different way. It's just not like you multiply. And I think that we do have the same issue with resistance. Where do we have the critical points? What happens at different critical points? And I mean, there are a few simple formulas which I could be quite critical against, saying that if a number, or let's say 5% of the people are out in the streets, then there will be a revolution and a social change and so on and forth. I think it is much more complex than that. And I think that you have to study various cases. But in spite of not being able to present a good answer to your clever question, I think that this example from medicine provides us with some kind of information, because also depending on what kind of medicine that you try to develop, the components, they act differently depending on which components they are. So my simple answer would be that we should not assume a simple multiplication, because it is complex. We need to take into consideration a number of issues, and those issues differ from situation to situation.
So it will be basically a path dependency.
I would say so, yeah, and it's individual, and I think it would be very difficult also from my kind of approach to what science can do to present formulas or anything similar to that. But at the same time, I do acknowledge the path dependency. Now let's listen to Mona, who should have a more clever reflection if you want to, or not.
Thank you. Don't put any pressure on me.
No, not at all. It was more like trying to buy you some time to develop an answer. But I think that you get the main message. What is your idea on it? Do you have anything? Thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, in engagement studies, you have this moment where you issue a call, and then you have this phenomenological aspect of it, where you have reflection. But the problem of upscaling, basically, when you invoke this idea of path dependency, you also have this issue of complexity studies also involved there. I think that you are also referring to that. Those are the main issues, even for me, when we are trying to reframe the whole modern dynamics in social sciences through this kind of akin or quite similar terms. It is important to basically have all these issues that you raised. So I'm also just
but I mean,
spinning off.
At the end of the day, we're always taken by surprise when you have the pivotal point in one way or another. Well, I mean, looking hinterwise, then you know that, well, I should have realized it, but when you see it as it is played out, then it is tremendously difficult trying to find the path that you know exists and that you perhaps might be able to identify after the event. And the second question was?
I don't remember.
About revolutions. But
How do revolutions happen?
I can say something about this too. I'm thinking that, first of all, I think there's often a collectiveness in, like, the base for every individual resistance. Like, often people who do individual resistance share the same subalternative or, subaltern identity position or the same discourses or, so it's not really individual from the beginning, right? So that also counts into when it pops up everywhere. And I also think that the Me Too is kind of interesting if you're going to look into individual resistance that actually turns into something very collective, like how people recognize themselves in each other, and also all the emotions that circulates in this fueling of resisting. Yeah. Okay. And then digitalization on the top of it, of course. Sorry. The second question was?
Of revolution. So how does the revolution fit into the ABCs of resistance?
I mean, if you take the example from Haiti, where we saw a revolution that actually became state building, then you will have it as a kind of entanglements of the various forms, where you first do have the avoidance, where you are working secretly, you are working hidden. And then after a while, so it's an evolution over time, we do see attempts to break. And when the breaking is successful, then the avoiding and the breaking is strengthened by the constructive alternatives that you're able to present. So I think that looking upon the Haitian revolution from the ABC perspective, that would be the main message. You get the more complex picture than saying that there was a pivotal point where a number of people were out in the streets. But then having presented or introduced the model, it should be acknowledged immediately that it is a simplification. It's more like a tool where you can open up for multi-eventual or a multi-factorial analysis, if you like. But then again, it needs to be applied to a certain revolution, and we have not applied it to the Haitian revolution, but it just serves as a good example if you look upon it briefly.
I think that Asaf Bayat's research, current research on revolutions, is quite interesting. We had him for a seminar like 3-4 weeks ago, and he said that the new revolutions are kind of individualized, because today people become engaged via social media. It's no clear leadership. There's no ideologies. There are no clear ideas what they want to do later on. But there are a couple of individuals who come together due to social media and they do a revolution. But afterwards, there's really no change, because these people, they didn't follow any clear idea what they wanted to have instead. What was the goal of the revolution? And so you can say that the individual resistance kind of undermine the collectiveness of revolutions today, which is also interesting.
So that would be a kind of a non-ideological revolution where you have different interests to form revolutionary activities.
We have Gazella first, and Marian.
Well, I was thinking during your very interesting presentation about form of resistance here, and in general, not only here but also globally. And what I'm aiming to is actually this resistance that is producing no change. So that is something which is very interesting to me, because in order to have change, you need to have some upscaling, as you said. And what if there are forms of resistance which are intentionally or unintentionally performed, how to say this, not to produce the change? So I will give you a few examples. For example, our institute was built on intellectuals dissidents. And we praised their act of collective, because there was 8 of them, resistance towards communist Yugoslavia and the regime back then. But when we researched their past through the secret documents which appeared in the meantime, we actually found out that some of them were collaborating with the regime. So I'm not saying that their dissent was actually part of this collaboration. I don't know, I will not claim that, but it sheds some shadow on the trust towards them. And I think trust is very important element of upscaling. And I will give you another example. For example, we have had a strong movement against Rio Tinto as water pollution, yes, environmental problems. And we had a movement which appeared, I wouldn't say out of nowhere, but there were persons who gained the trust because of some actions. They organized a collective resistance, protests, blockade of the bridge, etc., and they stopped at some point. And it, from my perspective, that helped to preserve actually the elite in power, this political elite, and not to change them. And I have no proof, of course, but I'm wondering how much of that was really, organized to do it like this. And probably this is not the sole example, and in this, I would say, especially in hybrid regimes, as Serbia is, there is a lot of manipulative acts which basically makes you distrust anyone, and that is really unhelpful for building resistance. So in your ABC structure, I could say that these kinds of dissent or these kinds of resistance can be can be classified in each of these three, A, B, C, but they are not made to really make a change, but they are made to preserve the situation, to build into stabilocracy, as they like to call it for our region, for example, to preserve what is it. And I think it would be really, I mean, I don't know if that is of interest of you, but for us, for example, I think it would be really interesting to have some pillar of research which would actually investigate how, I again say, intentional or unintentional resistance actually is helping to preserve the power, not to change the situation, the structure. And one more thing, I think that also sometimes there are arenas of action which are parallel, and maybe you could classify them as collective, as constructive resistance, like you have parallel institutions, for example. We had in Kosovo during the socialist period, for a long time, we had parallel educational institutions because they were not recognizing the state of Serbia and Yugoslavia as their state. But I could also think of globally of internet as parallel realm, which is actually helping, but also not helping the actual change. So these are some questions which crossed my mind. I cannot say that I have answers or anything, but this is like a comment for
Can I just put a very short bridge to this? As you can see, social engagement studies are very much about social change, or very much interested in how we get there. But is there a link between resistance and change? So in ABC, I was thinking now when you were speaking, is there like power resistant change? Do we have that bridge or not necessarily? So for example, the Maroon communities, of course they wanted some change. But so what is, just like a little addendum to Gazella's question?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you that some kinds of resistance really strengthen power, maintain and strengthen power. You can see that, like, if you go to Cambodia, you see civil society organizations that deal with gender, climate issues, exchange issues, and they make the regime looks really cool, dealing with all these questions, even though it's really repressive. So they're kind of helping power. And that is also how Foucault framed it, that resistance sometimes really support power. And so, I mean, we have been looking into various kinds of resistance, and some of those are really contaminated with power. But then there's also a link between resistance and social change, I would say. I mean, sometimes resistance succeeds in creating change, which makes it interesting. That is why we research resistance, because we want to encourage, or we are interested in social change, positive social change. That is, I mean, that's the motivation for us to do this research, as well as I think that's motivation for you to be interested in resistance. But yeah, do you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, you could have the intention to challenge power, and you could have the intention to achieve change, but I mean, there is of course no guarantee. And then taking into consideration the examples that you gave, where you had resistance of people looking for social change that were actually connected to the government, then of course one has to look more into detail to see if the social change that was achieved was improved or stopped, or if you have this kind of hybrid or gray zone where they actually contributed to change in spite of being associated with the government. I was thinking of a similar example that where you have, for example, the police officers going undercover, and then they start to identify with the movement that they are supposed to provide information on. So that is difficult. So I think it could actually work both ways, where you have to, I mean, the bottom line is that you have to look at the complexity, because intention is not the guarantee of a result, meaning social change. But I think that even, I would go as far as saying that even if we have an example of various resistance acts that do not create change, I still find them interesting. Because I think that it would be very difficult to identify a resistance act performed over a certain period of time that would have no effect. It could have an alternative effect. And then, of course, when do we say, at what time do we say that, well, this had no effect? I mean, some resistance campaigns, if we are talking about collective resistance, they have been going on for decade after decade after decade. And then just suddenly we are again taken by surprise, because then something is happening. Because now the components, they are starting to react in a way that they didn't do before. So I mean, it's interesting, and I think that maybe it could be very interesting looking upon those phenomena, those activities that has no obvious effect.
I'm thinking even when resistance is successful, as such as the Me Too in Sweden, which really made a change. I mean, still the movement constructed just certain victims, and some other victims were hidden, and I mean, only middle-class Swedish women were really involved in the movement, while other kinds of sexual violence, such as lethal sexual violence, were like, you know, covered up in some senses by the huge debate on Me Too, as well as other victims which were not included into the movement, like men exposed to sexual violence, for example. They experience this as really disempowering. So, I mean, there's a lot of complexity into it. And, yeah.
Marian Ivkovic. Are you still okay with 2 more questions?
I'd also like to thank you for a great talk, and indeed it's very clear to what extent there is an area of overlap between our 2 programs. And we also, as generally said, in the engagement studies, we also started out from a certain premise that the division into individual and collective engagement, resistance, or any related concept is inadequate. And so our idea of engagement also aims to transcend this divide by claiming that engagement is inherently intersubjective. So there is no such thing as actually purely individual engagement, because engagement entails the reflection on the rules and norms of social action, and rules and norms of social action are inherently intersubjective. Then even if someone is engaged totally individually in the sense of hidden resistance, as you proposed, let's say, reflecting on norms in some kind of isolation, it still contains this element of a call to others, and then, you know, this can materialize or not, but it's an open kind of opening towards others. So that's why I also think that this kind of binary division is not productive. And the question is, at the start of the lecture, I saw briefly one of the points said that the nature of domination sets the conditions or the coordinates for the forms of resistance. And I was wondering what that exactly means, because it can mean 2 different things as far as I understand. It can mean, in a simpler sense, it can mean the nature of domination determines whether resistance will be open or hidden, or whether it will be primarily avoidance, or whether it will be some kind of attempt to create a social change. But then it can also mean something different, and because I come from a critical theory tradition, this other meaning is quite close to me, and that is the meaning that the nature of domination conditions the horizons of resistance, because we are the products of domination. That would be the whole, you know, Foucauldian and kind of critical theoretical legacy would claim that basically we, as products of a certain social order, cannot resist that social order except within a certain horizon that is already set by those systems of domination. And if we look at contemporary capitalism and the whole widespread impression that resistance does not achieve any kind of substantive change, this whole idea of resistance not being able to transcend the horizons of capitalism becomes quite actual once again. And what would your framework say about that? How do we approach more complex forms of domination, those which, like contemporary capitalism, commodify resistance, incorporate it, ritualize it, so on and so forth? Thanks.
No, but we just wrote an article about politics in the neoliberal in a neoliberal era, where we just discussed the issue that you bring up here, that that power is kind of becoming vague and far away, or like entangled in desires and other kind of forms of power, and so on and so forth, and that makes resistance sometimes difficult, or difficult to formulate, at least, like an effective resistance.
And I also think we could add to your comment that it is really difficult sometimes to identify what is power and what is resistance. I mean, it's a continuous gray zone. But I think that one possibility, and that is not something that we have discussed, so maybe we could have discussion about that as well. But I mean, a point of departure would be to always consider resistance as being a reaction against power. And then if we do that for the sake of the argument, then I think that the ABC model would be quite useful, because then we have to identify the power first, and then we identify the responses, and then we can categorize it, and then we can try to, or at least have a possibility to discover the complexity as such. If I understood your remark correctly.
Yes, and also my remark was that in present conditions, it gets more difficult to identify power.
Yeah.
And okay, yes. But in general, would you say that resistance can create some kind of radically new social acts that are not, let's say, conditioned by the existing social order? Yes, right. That was the question.
Okay. I mean, that would be, from my perspective, a question of how successful you are in your construction, in your constructive resistance part. When can you talk about something entirely new, liberated from the heritage of the past? I mean, theoretically, it would be possible. Then you have to look upon it in a practical sense. But I mean, for example, as one member of our research group, he has been studying the Zapatistas. I mean, of course, they are in relation to something old, to something already existing, but they are also establishing quite new and radical alternatives. Is it entirely new? Is it dependent on what is already existing? Most likely, yes. And I don't know if you have, is there any other examples of when we are kind of establishing something more or less entirely new? I mean,
I'm thinking that neoliberalism maybe fuels constructive kinds of resistance. That when you live in a neoliberal era and you want to resist that, it's easier to withdraw and create something new. Create, like all the people who moved from Germany and the Netherlands now to the forests in Sweden, and to get a new kind of life, to create another kind of life. I mean, so a combination of avoidance and constructive resistance is, I think that we can see that is like increasing due to this more vague power, which is difficult to protest against in traditional ways.
Perhaps,
I don't know if I answered your question there, but maybe that was the first question.
But I think perhaps, I mean, a precondition for establishing the constructive alternative due to the impact of the neoliberal system and capitalism would be, as Mona stated, avoidance.
Yes, definitely agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. And then what are the forms, constructive forms established? Well, it's not something entirely new, but perhaps it is based on a romantic vision of how it was before. And then, of course, it is not something developed in freedom from the past or the existing preconditions, because they don't have to be present. They could also be historical. So, but it's a very interesting question. And I mean, at the end of the day, it touches upon our room of maneuver, or our room for maneuver. And I think that we always would like to believe that it is a bit bigger than it actually is.
Please.
So, thanks for your presentation. I was thinking when you were talking about everyday resistance, and this somehow let me think about everyday nationalism, Mikael as well. So I was thinking, is resistance always a conscious act, or are there forms of resistance that are internalized, that are not in the sense of hidden, that they are still conscious, but they're unconsciously, and then maybe a collective memory in the sense of unconscious ways of resistance, because then they can travel for a very long time and internalize in some kind of societal or cleavages in society, if you want to use that form, but something that prolongs over a longer term, because you were mentioning forms of resistance that were very short, and then you were mentioning some that were longer. So I was just thinking, how can you categorize these unconscious forms of resistance, or would you have another name for them? Thanks.
Unintentional resistance would be the label, and we have been writing about that, and we also have been writing about that in opposition to James Scott, because we understand him as he is arguing that resistance always needs to be intentional, and we do not agree with that.
No. We did a study recently where we interviewed assistant nurses during the COVID pandemic, and how they have, when they have just a few hours every month and have hard to pay their bills, how they navigate in this when they're not allowed to go to work, because that would break the rules, right? But they can't pay the rent if they stay at home, and how they break the rules and they go to work with sneezing, trying to hide it though, so they kind of aware that it's not okay to be there, but still all the explanations that they give around the sneezing is like they suddenly becomes allergic, and there's this, and they construct all these narratives that allows them to, drawing on pre-pandemic discourses, that allows them to still go to work. And I think it has been tremendously interesting to do these interviews, and shows all the complexity of people, how they resist without really knowing it, but still knowing it somehow. You know, it's like,
And it's kind of undermining the entire Swedish grand strategy, which has been flourishing in the press, of how you should deal with the COVID-19 epidemic. So it is an unintentional resistance against the authorities' strategy of dealing with the pandemic. So that would be an example of the unintentional resistance. And
the resistance emerged from another kind of power relations, the gig economy, and then which is in turn created by the different neoliberal policies. So it's like you can really see how power and resistance, different kinds of power, and resistance entangled in interesting ways.
And then having the gig economy as perhaps the most obvious example of the current capitalism and neoliberalism. So then there is, I don't know, about the possibility to tie the entire narrative together, where unintentional resistance is, I think, tremendously interesting to study.
Because I was thinking, you mentioning protests that evolve over the internet and when ethnics that are constructed through the internet. So the question is whether are those people resisting in is it in an intentional way or is it conscious way how they resist, or is it already other forms of intentional resistance hidden underneath because of the structure of neoliberalism?
I mean, what could be the outmost hope of the ABC model is that it will assist us in peeling and identifying the complexity and the entanglements of various expressions of resistance, may they be intentional or unintentional. We still think so, but we don't know. But I think that we really need to dig into the complexity. And it's also, I mean, it's not only complexity, but it is increasing complexity, rapidly increasing complexity.
That's important.
Yeah.
There is one more question, and I would like to also pose a question. Would you survive us?
Yes, we hope so. we will give it a go.
Okay, and Luigi, please.
Okay, so I would like to join others in thanking you for this really thought-provoking lecture. And I would like to get us back to the start, because I got really captured and struck by the contradictory power of your first A concept, the avoidance resistance. So I was thinking, how do we understand the avoidance resistance at a very minimal conceptual level? Is avoiding resistance, in some sense, avoiding of the resistance itself? How do we deal with the resistance that avoids itself? What is that X without X? What is the resistance without resistance? And is it then, maybe following your examples, is it then in some moments of this development equated with hiding or escape? I don't know. The ideas of Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, was crossing my mind during your presentation, and he wrote extensively on concepts such as lines of flight or deterritorialization, that's a very hard word to pronounce, and the ways in which those processes would help us escape the flows of powers and domination. So on that line, I would just drop two examples. When you think about Christians hiding in catacombs, is that avoiding resistance, or maybe the resistance during the Second World War in some sense? Is that avoidance resistance? It's hiding. You have some third term maybe. And yeah, that would be the first question. And the second one is maybe proposing you on the line of what Gazella was mentioning, the Rio Tinto project that will hear the ecological concerns and the reaction to that. And also something that happened in France, that was happening and is still happening in some parts of France, is les zones à défendre, the zones to defend. People are, the airport in Nantes is the famous example where people occupy some places, they just stay there in order to defend something from some developmental project. They wanted to build an airport there, and a whole bunch of people just stay there and stop them from doing that. So maybe that the letter could come up in that ABC, like defense, resistance, would that be that model of something that is not really going well with the social change, something that is not working? So yeah, I was just stop here.
Can I please just really go on with
Yeah,
Andrea here? Because I was thinking, is it okay? Can I continue? I was thinking also about a thing that we haven't mentioned thus far, and this is the war in Ukraine. Yesterday I was at an event which was called the Transnational Solidarity with Ukrainian Feminists, organized by Judith Butler, Irina Zherebkina, and Sabine Hark. And so we thought that the main word is going to be solidarity. It turned out that the main word, at least for the Ukrainian feminists, was resistance. And so I was thinking before we met and now after this as well, I mean, that's some kind of deed, that's some kind of defense there. I mean, and resistance comes with the defense. Or not. I don't know. I'm thinking now with you, and I was also somehow struck. I mean, I loved that, but I was also somehow struck that the ABC somehow goes with peaceful, anti-violence resistance. I think that there is non-violence is somehow very much there. But what do we do when we have violence? And when there is now resistance in Ukraine? I was also thinking with regard to that, now NATO is possibly coming to Sweden. So what about resistance to the, I don't know, who are you resisting? If you resist NATO, who are you resisting at the moment in Sweden, for example? And so how does that pack as well?
Well, I can say something about the defense, and I really like that idea. We should really, elaborate on that, on the defense of the letter in the end of the categorization. I'm thinking now that it relates to the Palestinian sumud, doesn't it? How staying on the ground and try to just be there. And I think that we have some kind of counted as breaking resistance, that we're just gonna be here. Whatever you want to, if you want to move, we're not. Like, we are going against your norms, against your policies, against your action here. But maybe it needs a letter. Yeah.
It's good in Sweden because then we have 28 letters to develop the model. I mean, but the D is a good idea, ABCD model, resistance. And I was thinking regarding the French land occupiers. I mean, they are of great interest, and they are included as a case in a current research application that we have submitted. So we don't know very much about them more than we totally agree with you that they would be very interesting to look upon. And I also think that you make a very interesting point, because as you posed your question, I started to make kind of a self-reflection. And we have been working with this resistance perspective approach for at least 15 years. And when we were granted research money for the first time, where we were allowed, or which made it possible for us to research this more widely, then the research application was about civil society-based democracy promoting resistance, or to be even more detailed, non-violent civil society-based democracy promoting resistance. And that is, of course, only a very limited part of all resistance that is played out. And gradually, we have expanded the focus, but I would say that we are still very much into the non-violent part of resistance, even though that we are looking upon or we are hoping to look upon more violent expressions as well, as for example with non-genderist activists, if you could call them like that. It feels a bit odd to use that label, but you see what I mean. And also where we have resistance that is violent, non-violent. I mean, also with these hybrid categories. But I think that we are approaching the entire field from a certain perspective, and that is reflected in the ideas that we propose. So, guilty as charged.
When it comes to the avoidance, I really think that we should look in more into how resistance is hiding. And for example, we went to Cambodia and interviewed civil society now, and the regime is getting more repressive. And it turned out that they, for example, they go to organizations, go to the local level, and then they make people there resist. Like they encourage people to resist. So it's like resistance through encourage other people to resist, or resist through an ombudsman, to have someone else to do the work for you, kind of an interpassive resistance, where you sit still in the boat, but other people do it for you. You see them do it, but it was you who created it. And what is that? What kind of, how do we really understand that kind of resistance? And also, like, waiting turned out as a huge strategy for many, because, you know, they can't do resistance now, so they pretend to be gender organizations or climate change issue organizations and wait until the space will open up for them to do human rights, promote human rights issues. So what is waiting? What kind of resistance is that? I mean, there was so many things that were interesting to look at in an environment that has been quite open and now closely has closed down. You know, how people act, how they hide. So I know that was your question, but I'm just, when you said avoidance, I just thought that wanted to add something here.
And then you have the whole business trying to categorize it, and that is difficult because the categories they are simple, but the real world is complicated. And as soon as you start to categorize, that is an act of violence.
Of course.
I mean, as Mona said, I mean, we have been looking upon what we found labeled as proxy resistance, where we have subaltern people performing resistance through people who are in a power position, made out of solidarity.
The other way around, right? People in power positions doing resistance for subaltern people.
Yeah, they are kind of used by the subaltern people. They are playing on the solidarity, and then they act on behalf of the subaltern. But then we have the inverted proxy resistance, where subaltern people are performing resistance on behalf of the one in power. So it's tremendously complicated. I mean, a simple solution would be trying not to categorize at all. Just kind of acknowledge that reality is tremendously complex, but at the same time it's quite challenging trying to make those categories. And I also think that, I mean, if you would like to add even a further letter, A, B, C, D, E, then you have the emotional aspects of resistance, which is tremendously interesting. And also, I mean, as a further reflection on your remark, the emotions that you feel yourself trying to study violent resistance, which could from time to time, I guess, we haven't done it, but I mean, if I guess that could be quite emotionally difficult in one way or another, with resistance that you really, really, from the bottom of your heart, dislike. So I mean, that is a challenge.
So we wouldn't see our categories as fixed. It's a process, and the next time we come back, we will have.
we
We
promise at
pursue a
least
new narrative.
a D and an E as additions to the model.
Adding an F too.
Maybe you end up with alphabet.
Yeah, I think so.
No.
Maybe we should go for the Cambodian alphabet then, because there are so many more letters. So we can really have a wide model covering everything.
If there are no, I think that we are now also with the time, and if there's no more questions, I really want to thank you for coming here, for telling us the newest layer of your very long research, and I hope that we provided you with some thoughts with our discussion here. And I hope that we'll continue collaborating in various ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for letting us to come here and present our research, and for all your ideas, which we will bring with us.
Yeah, I could also just say thank you very much for your attention, your questions, and this is our first trip outside Sweden since COVID, and sitting here in such a stimulating environment, you realize how much you have missed it. So this is what research is about. So thank you very much for your engagement. It's deeply appreciated.